All right, so I'm gonna get started. Um, it's actually bittersweet that this is the last lecture of the group therapy series. So I'm actually feeling some feelings that one might experience at the end of group. So there's some interesting parallel process going on with the lecture, as well as what one might experience um, in a group that is terminating, that is closing. So, but as with all of the lessons, we start with learning objectives, and uh, we want to understand the group dynamics associated with the group process and development, right? We'll talk about uh, the main leader and member task at the final stage of group. And you may recall, even though we've moved away from it, we talked about the initial stage, transition stage, a working stage. Now we're at the final stage, right? And we want to think about the main tasks that the group leader, as well as the members of the group, experience at the end of group. And at this point, we also are thinking about, well, what did we get out of the group, right? So it's very important to think about that. We also want to identify any issues that are important when effectively terminating a group, right? So you want to pay attention to those factors and address them appropriately. We also want to pay attention to feelings of separation. It is a perfectly normal experience to mourn the loss, right? Termination comes with ending a group, so it's not uncommon for people to mourn the loss of the closeness they had with members of the group. We'll talk about various guidelines for saying goodbye in an effective way, strategies to evaluate or review the group experience. We'll talk about how to implement some of the things that you've learned in group, outside of group. So how to generalize from the group setting to the real world, which is something I've mentioned in previous videos and lectures, is that, the group serves as a laboratory to practice and tinker and figure things out. But the goal is to generalize from the group out to the real world. So that's very important to think about, well, how are you going to apply this after group? All right. We'll also talk about important kinds of feedback we're going to give each other, right? And the final stage. And the feedback is multi-directional. It goes from one group member to other group members, the group members who haven't spoken to each individual member, and then all members to the group leader, and then back. So it's multi-dimensional, multi-directional, the feedback we get. And then in terms of how we utilize homework and contracts to help us solidify or consolidate that learning. Homework is an interesting thing because homework allows you to take the group experience from being 90 minutes or 60 minutes in some cases to being a 24/7 operation. You could actually take that exercise and bring it with you at all times. We also want to think about how to handle setbacks and relapse prevention, right? What happens if you go backwards and you don't have the group to fall on, right? And we'll address that. We'll talk about evaluation, co-leader issues at the end of the group, and then follow-up after the group ends. And anything that was redundant, I skipped, even though it's on the slide. So the final stage of group is absolutely vital. It's critical, and it's just as important as every other part of the group process. It gives members an opportunity to really clarify and integrate the meaning of their experience within the group setting. So it's a reflection point in the group process. So that gives you time to really make meaning of what happened. You also get to identify any gains you've had during the group process. And I mentioned that when setting up a group, you should have goals for the group as a whole. But each member of the group can personalize their goals and see if there's anything that they gained or would have liked to gain, but they're still in progress on mastery through the group process. And then you could decide from the new behaviors that you've learned, the new skills you've acquired, how you're going to apply it in your everyday life, and a commitment to applying it in your everyday life, not just in the group, the treatment room. Now, when we talk about open groups and closed groups, you may recall that open groups, people can enter and leave the group at their own pace. Closed groups, people tend to start and end at the same point. But if you're at the final stage of group, right? So, and you personally are going to leave the group, it's critical to give adequate notice before terminating. My general rule is that you should give yourself 2 to 3 weeks for people to say goodbye. So if you are in an open group setting and you're going to leave the group, build in a transition period that's going to allow the member themselves to adjust to no longer being part of the group, but it also allows other members of the group to say goodbye. And you know, saying goodbye is important because you've shared some laughs together, you've shared some pain together. And when it's time to say goodbye, you know, if you don't get that opportunity, it really deprives everybody the opportunity to heal and mourn that loss. Now, when we talk about saying goodbye, what it means, whether it's absolutely final or not, that's going to be culturally dependent, and each person has their own value system around what endings are. If endings are absolute, then it's very important to make sure that there are these goodbyes put into it. If the ending is, oh, it's just temporary, or, I'll see you again, then maybe the effect of not saying goodbye is reduced. Now, you also want to, regardless of whether it's an open group or a closed group, you want to make sure that you get consolidation of learning. So if a person is going to leave the group, you might ask them, before you leave, can you identify 3 things you've learned from the group? And that's an important thing, even in the classroom, I ask that question, well, what are 3 things you got from group, right? Because it's preparing you to say goodbye. And then it allows you to review, when you first started with the group, what were your goals? What did you want to accomplish? What did you accomplish? Was there any unfinished business that, you're leaving the group for another reason, but there still is unfinished business? And if there's unfinished business that people need to work on, maybe you make a referral to another group or individual therapy as deemed appropriate, right? So you have to make sure that you're being fair to that individual, even when they say goodbye. Now, in a closed group, so now there is no change in the group dynamic from people just coming and going throughout. You really have experienced something special together. And everybody went through the same thing, right? Because everybody started together, everybody's going to end together. So it's not uncommon to have to work through the feelings of separation. It's a good time if it's a 12-week group to ask people, well, what did you assume group therapy was like before you started, and now what do you experience it to be like now? And you can compare and contrast earlier perceptions versus later perceptions and how they might differ, right? Most people, if we go back to the mindset of people in the initial stage of group, there's a lot of misunderstandings about group. There's a lot of anxiety around group. So it's transformative. The group process itself is transformative. So you can compare and contrast earlier perceptions versus later perceptions. You could deal with any unfinished business. Now, dealing with unfinished business can be, well, what didn't you get to of your personal goals? Or dealing with unfinished business could be, is there something you really wanted to say to a member of the group that you didn't have a chance to, that now that we're ending, you would like to, right? So it's interesting, right? So sometimes people hold in their thoughts about another member of a group till the end. And it might be complimentary and it might be critical. And sometimes we ask for, both constructive criticism, and we talked about how to give appropriate criticism, right? You can ask group members, say, what is your biggest concern or fear about one member of the group as they leave this group experience? Or it could be complimentary. What is one thing that you've seen another person change or grow that you'd like to give them a sense of praise for? So you can ask different questions to get people dialoguing with one another. Now, people make meaning in different ways of the group experience. If we were on campus, I usually have a whole party at the end of group with cake and everything like that. But obviously in a virtual world, we can't do that. But, that's a personal gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude to all of you. And then reviewing the group process is a given in either way. Now, we oftentimes say that because closed groups tend to be more solution focused, tend to be more CBT, psychoeducational, all that stuff, we can say that this was merely practice for the real world, and it's your job to take this into the real world, carry it further. We talked about giving feedback. Now, you want to have contracts and homework for people to sign before a group. They sign a contract of the expectations of group. Each week, you typically assign homework in a closed group. If there are setbacks or issues that emerge, it's okay to throw out the goals and objectives of that week and deal with setbacks. If a person has left the group and they have a setback, you could either bring them back to the group if it's still ongoing, or find them another group if the group has closed. Now, here, as I said, this is a time where you give people prompts to reflect on one another. So there are many ways that you could get people to talk and reflect on one another. So my greatest fear for you is whatever it is. And a person might share that. My hope for you is whatever it is. I hope that you'll seriously consider if you want to offer some guidance. I see you blocking your strengths by whatever it is. Now, we did that in group today. We talked about how does, not speaking up interfere with fully experiencing the classroom, right? So people can block their own strengths. Something that I hope you will think about doing for yourself is whatever it might be, fill in the blank. These are just examples of prompts. They're sentence completion tasks. You could say whatever comes to mind, but you'll notice it's an icebreaker activity to give people the opportunity to give parting words to one another. So in terms of applying lessons to everyday life, it's your job as the leader to facilitate that. It's your job to develop action plans or treatment plans um, as you go. So you want to make sure that that happens. You want to tell people, especially if you're working with gambling or addictions or things like that, that relapses happen. So you can fall back and similar to the values exercise we did from acceptance and commitment therapy, you could be on one ring of the dartboard and get closer to the bullseye or further away. And that does change. Growth is not a linear process. Sometimes you're moving forward, sometimes you're moving backwards. And be prepared that in the absence of group, it is possible to regress. And that's not a big deal as long as you're still committed towards moving forward. Now, when we talk about group is a means to an end. The real work happens outside of group. So the group was supposed to serve a purpose to help you get to a greater level of assertiveness, a greater level of self-disclosure, a greater level of insight, whatever it might be. The group process was meant to serve that purpose, not actually fix you or solve all your problems. You're meant to take the lessons and bring them. And in some weeks, you might have gained a lesson more than in other weeks. But over the course of group therapy, there should be pearls of wisdom that you've acquired along the way. Now, change, it can be slow, it can be subtle, it's not going to happen overnight. You want to focus on your personal growth over changing other people. If you listen to non-functional groups or non-working groups, people will point fingers at one another rather than focusing on their own change process. So you want to focus more on your change process over other people's change process. And you could do what you wish with the lessons you've learned. So you have to decide what you want to do with them. Now, evaluation is absolutely critical. You may recall in an earlier lesson, I talked to you that evaluation is part of the group process or is part of the group experience. Because if you don't have evaluation as part of it, you have no way of knowing whether the group accomplished anything. So before you run a group, you should already have a mindset as to how you're going to assess the group experience. It's ongoing. That can happen during the process, but at the end of the group, you should have some kind of assessment process to determine whether change took place, whether growth took place. Assessment can occur in many different ways. It can occur in a formal way, or it can occur in a more informal way. Formal assessment comes with surveys, rating scales, questionnaires, and things like that. But an informal way could be more of follow-up interviews. The same way you had a pre-group meeting, you might have follow-up interviews to ask people their experience separate from the group. Now, when you're terminating, when you're moving towards termination, it's not the time to bring up new issues. Now we're consolidating, we're working towards making sense of all the experiences we've had. So do not open up issues that you won't have enough time to work. If there are issues that are unresolved, it's okay to discuss them as unfinished business and say, you know what, I would have liked for us to do A, B, C. We didn't get there. We wound up focusing on X, Y, Z. and just acknowledge what was accomplished and what was not accomplished, and that's fine. No group accomplishes everything they set out to. It's very rare for that to happen. So acknowledging it versus discussing it and trying to do a deep dive into it are two different things. You can discuss the unfinished business, but not try and work through it. You also want to ask people how they feel about ending group, right? So it could, depending on how one's group experience was, some people are going to be more okay and non-emotional about it, but other people are going to feel as though, they're going to miss something. And that's important to hear everyone's experience about unfinished business. You, as group leaders or co-leaders, you help people evaluate their experience, and you want to also do an evaluation of the group leaders. So you want to assess, well, how well did we work together as group leaders? Now, you might see that the class, I meet with the group leader once or twice before they run the group. So many group leaders don't do that. And you wind up having people going in very different directions than one another. Whereas if you talk to one another and you talk about, well, what did we want to accomplish with this session, it's very easy to evaluate how well you work together. Were you on the same page, or were you pulling in opposite directions? That's going to be very, very important to do. All right. Now, follow up. So build follow up into your sessions. That's important. You want to have scheduled meetings for this so that you can say, okay, well, we ran the group. How did it go? Follow up is fine. There are some group leaders who have booster groups, which is just a fancy way of saying that their group sessions are graduated from a very basic level to a more advanced level, and they build in these follow-up group sessions into a more advanced group. Or it could be just as simple as one singular follow-up session that just occurs once, right? So in this follow-up session or booster sessions, you can explore, okay, well, what has been happening in the last 3 months since group hasn't occurred? Have you had any difficulties? Have you had any regression, any major changes since leaving the group? You could talk about feelings and thoughts that have emerged about the group experience since the assessment, because people may not share readily. So you might get that information 3 months later. You also might give them you can give them with Google Forms. It's pretty cheap and easy. You just send them a link. You can have them fill out a brief questionnaire, or you could contact them through Zoom, which is also free. Very easy technology to touch base with them at a later point. Now, members of the group are going to have to deal with separation and termination. It's very common for members of the group to feel a loss. Now, when you run a group in a graduate program, some of you will graduate and never see each other again. So it's going to be, the feelings can be compounded if it's done as an experiential group, right? So it's important to understand that as well. You also want to evaluate anything unfinished business related to group or anything else, and evaluate the impact of the group. Now, you always want to temper a group, especially a closed-ended group. If it's 10, 12 weeks of sessions, you have to scale back your expectations relative to an open group, right? So you have to understand that change takes place very slowly. It takes time, takes practice, it takes effort. So if a person did not fully execute everything that they learned across the 3 months, that's okay. All right. Now, a leader functions, we have to facilitate the feelings or the discussions about feelings around termination. We have to invite you with the opportunity to deal with unfinished business. You might actually give a contract or ask people to write post therapy contracts that they're going to commit to something, provide opportunity to give one another feedback, and so forth. Now, we think that the therapy process, you have to keep confidentiality just during the group. But for the most part, you want to make sure that confidentiality is maintained even after the group is over, right? So that would be like me talking about my clients and talking about what they said after they've left therapy. There's still HIPAA involved. There's still responsibilities involved there that we might want to deal with, right? So make sure that people are not sharing other people's business after group is over. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't get to exchange numbers and contact information. That's very, very common to do. So you might talk to one another. The subgrouping issue is less of a problem, but confidentiality, it remains intact. If a person has a setback, you can offer private consultations to help them move along. You can provide the follow-up group session or follow-up interviews, as I mentioned, that are separate from therapy. If a person still needs additional work, you can refer them out to a more advanced group or individual therapy as needed. And you're, as a group leader, you want to make sure that you evaluate both strengths and weaknesses. So you want a person to talk about the things that didn't go the way they wanted to. And with that, that is a very fast primer on the final aspects of group. So I'm going to stop the recording there.